Salam, peace be upon you, episode 13, part 5. Phi is not difference, possibility versus outcome. There is one primitive, phi, the holophase, a continuous cyclic order that makes reality readable. Now let me bring you forward, gently, from where we have already been. We did not begin with a universe already built. We did not begin with a stage called space or a clock called time. We did not begin with matter as the first actor, or energy as the first fuel. We began with what makes anything speakable at all, with what makes anything checkable, with what makes anything shareable, with what makes truth possible as something more than a private feeling. Episode 12 installed the firewall, the discipline that stops narrative drift. It forces us to earn each concept before we use it. It forces us to stop smuggling in familiar furniture and calling it fundamental. And episode 13 is where we slow down and do something almost nobody does. We look at the foundation before we start building with it. Episode 13 has two movements. First, undifferentiated phi. Phi before any readable change. Phi as permission. Phi as the silent ground that must exist before a universe can become public. Second, differentiated phi. Phi once change becomes readable under licensing. How omega, kappa, and nu appear as inseparable readouts. How topology and tallies become lawful. How persistence and memory become possible. How every claim remains governed by prediction and falsification. We are still in the first movement. We are still on the silent ground. And here is why the first movement must come before the second. Because if you don't understand the permission layer, you will treat your later readouts as primitive. You will treat your later measurements as the ground. You will treat your later language as the source. Then you will rebuild old habits, just with new words. This part is a vow against that. A vow to keep phi clean. And here is the firewall sentence, the contract that keeps us honest. If you hear me smuggling space, time, energy, matter, or dynamics as primitives here, treat it as an error. Good. Now we can enter part 5. Because part 5 is the moment we separate two things that most minds accidentally fuse. We separate capacity from outcome. We separate permission from manifestation. We separate the possibility of difference from difference itself. That separation sounds subtle, but it is the hinge of the entire architecture. If you miss it, everything that follows becomes confusion dressed as confidence. So let me tell you a story about how this finally became clear to me. Not in a lecture hall, not in a library, but in a room so quiet you could hear the dust settling. It was winter, Kabul light. That thin, pale daylight that feels like it is thinking. My teacher placed a rubab on the floor between us. If you've never seen one, imagine a wooden body carved by hand, strings stretched across it, and underneath, sympathetic strings that can hum even when untouched, if the air is right. He didn't touch it. He just looked at me and said, "Listen." I listened. I heard distant traffic, a faint call to prayer, wind at the window. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Listen to the rubab." I stared at it. It was completely still. "I don't hear anything," I said. He smiled. That smile that means the lesson is about to move from your ears into your bones. "Exactly," he said. "But listen deeper. Not with your ears, with your understanding." Then he asked the question that broke something open in me. "Can you hear the possibility?" I didn't know how to answer. "The possibility of music," he he said softly. Right now, no note is sounding, but the instrument contains something real. Not sound, not silence, something earlier. The permission for sound to be different from silence. He let the room hold the sentence. Then he plucked one string. A single note rose, clean and sharp, and hung in the air like a lantern. Then it faded. Silence returned. He looked at me. The note is a difference, he said. The instrument's ability to produce a note, that is not the note. It is what came before the note. It is what makes the note possible. And then he said the line that you must carry through the rest of this entire series. Phi is not the difference. Phi is the permission for difference. That is part 5. Now I want to make the core claim so clear that even a tired mind at midnight can hold it. Here is the core claim. Phi is not the event of things being different. Phi is the capacity for them to be different. Let me say it again in even simpler words. Phi is not the change. Phi is what makes change possible. Phi is not the distinction itself. Phi is what makes distinction possible. This sounds almost too small, but watch what happens when you try to build anything without it. You can't, because every something you might try to start with is already a distinction. A particle is distinct from not particle. A field is distinct from not field. A law is distinct from not law. A state is distinct from another state. So if you start with any of these, you have already assumed what you needed to explain. You assumed that difference is already meaningful. Part 5 refuses to cheat. Part 5 says, before difference can be meaningful, something must make meaning of difference possible. That something is not another object, not another substance, not another hidden force. It is the bare permission that non-identity can exist. The bare permission that this can be distinguishable from that. That is phi in the undifferentiated movement. Now, why does this matter so much? Because if you confuse capacity with outcome, you commit a category error that poisons everything. Let me show you how this error looks. People point to something in the world, some dramatic feature, and say, that must be the foundation. They point to energy and say, energy is the root. They point to consciousness and say, mind is the root. They point to mathematics and say, form is the root. They point to information and say, bits are the root. But every one of those is already an outcome, already a differentiated structure, already a pattern that presupposes distinguishability. If you call an outcome the foundation, you haven't reached the foundation. You've just renamed the furniture. And you can always ask the question that exposes the cheat. What makes that outcome distinguishable at all? What makes energy different from no energy? What makes mind different from not mind? What makes a bit different from no bit? What makes true different from false? If your foundation cannot answer that without circularity, it is not a foundation. So part 5 is our discipline against circularity. It says, stop pointing at outcomes. Find the permission. Now let me give you a second scene that made this practical for me. In the weaving factory, there is a moment that outsiders misunderstand. They think weaving begins when the first knot is tied. But the masters will tell you, no. Weaving begins earlier. There is a day when the loom is prepared. Warp threads stretched tight. Wool dyed and sorted. Pattern chosen. Everything is ready. But nothing is woven. And the room is strangely quiet. Not because people are absent, but because the weavers are present in a different way. They sit in front of the empty loom. No movement, just attention. As an apprentice, I hated this. I wanted action. I wanted progress. I wanted to start. One morning, I finally asked, "What are we waiting for?" My teacher didn't even open his eyes. "We are not waiting," he said. "We are witnessing." "Witnessing what?" I asked. He pointed at the empty loom. "Look," he said, "the carpet is not here, and yet the carpet is already possible. The difference between empty loom and finished carpet is not yet actual, but the permission for that difference is already present." He picked up a strand of wool. "In your hand," he said, "this is only wool. In the carpet, it can become a rose. It can become a border. It can become a bird. Not because the wool contains a bird inside it like a hidden object, but because the possibility space is real. The loom, the threads, the pattern, together they create the permission for certain differences to exist." Then he said something that aligns perfectly with the holophase stance. If the permission is wrong, no amount of knots will save you. Because you can work hard inside a broken possibility. You can tie 1,000 knots and still never get a rose if the conditions that allow the difference between rose and not rose are not present. That is what Part 5 is protecting. We are not yet tying knots. We are not yet building a universe. We are establishing the permission layer that makes any universe possible. Now, let's tighten the logic. In Part 3, we established primitive comparability, the first permission. In Part 4, we established gauge relational essence, that only relations speak, not absolutes. Part 5 sits between them like a hinge, and it clarifies something extremely important. Comparability is not the same as an actual comparison result. The capacity for different is not the same as the event different happened. You can hold the capacity without any outcome being selected yet. That's why in this undifferentiated movement, we keep saying, before any readable change. Because readable change is already outcome space, already differentiation, already public structure. Here we are still in the logical soil, still earning the right to speak. Now I want you to test this inside your own mind. Try to make a statement without relying on comparison. Try. I'm here. Here versus not here. Am versus am not. This is true. True versus false. This versus not this. I understand. Understand versus not understand. Even silence. Silence is meaningful only because it is distinguishable from sound. So the permission for distinction is not optional. It is not a poetic preference. It is the skeleton of speakability. If you remove it, you do not get a more pure reality. You get a reality that cannot be said, cannot be checked, cannot be shared. Not because it is mystical, but because it has no grammar. So Part 5 is grammar at its most minimal. Now, because this is holophase and not conventional physics, we must keep our levels clean. We are not saying phi is a thing in the world, like a particle. We are not saying phi is a substance. We are not saying phi is energy. When we later use the word energy, it will be a tally, a bookkeeping count of pattern change, not a metaphysical fuel. Here, even the tallies are not yet earned, because tallies already assume measurable differences. Here, we are earning the permission that makes measurement possible. Now let's place prediction at the heart of it, the way the firewall demands. If phi is truly the capacity for difference, not the difference itself, then something must follow. A strong claim must make a strong expectation. So here is the prediction, stated in plain language. If this claim is true, then every successful description of reality will, at bottom, be a description of distinguishable possibilities and the licensed ways they become stable outcomes. In other words, whenever you think you have found a fundamental thing, you will be able to re-express it as a structured way that distinctions can exist and persist, not as a substance, as a pattern of permitted difference. And you should expect this across every domain that becomes public and checkable. In measurement, what you read will always be this compared to that, never this absolutely. In reasoning, proofs will always rely on identity and non-identity. In computation, states will always be distinguishable. In language, meanings will always be separations. In science, experiments will always compare predictions to outcomes. This is not a vague prediction like everything is connected. This is operational. It says, if you try to build public knowledge, you will always find comparability underneath, and you will never be able to eliminate it without destroying the possibility of public knowledge. Now let's state the falsification condition equally cleanly. Because the firewall demands that every claim must tell you what would break it. Here is the falsification. If someone can demonstrate a publicly checkable phenomenon, a phenomenon that can be measured, replicated, and shared, whose complete description requires no distinguishability anywhere, then this claim fails. Let me say that in simpler words. If anyone can show a real shared fact that does not depend on this, not that, in any way, then phi is not fundamental. Not a private feeling, not beyond language poetry. A real public science, a working method that does not use identity, difference, comparison, or discrimination anywhere in its structure. If that exists, we revise or reject the claim. And now I will tell you why this falsification condition is so hard to satisfy. Not because we are trying to protect a belief, but because the act of showing anything publicly already demands distinction. To show is to separate what is shown from what is not shown. To verify is to compare claim with result. To replicate is to match one outcome with another. So if someone claims to have escaped distinction, we have a very simple test. Ask them to demonstrate it without demonstrating it. Because demonstration is relational. That's the point. Now, I need to stamp scope and limits, because this is where people drift. This claim applies to the domain of knowability, to any reality that can become public, to any universe that can be spoken about, to any framework where true and false can be meaningful. It does not apply to absolute nothingness, because absolute nothingness cannot be pointed to, cannot be distinguished, cannot be discussed. The moment you speak of it, you have already left it. So we stay disciplined. We are describing the conditions for speakability, not making metaphysical poems about the unspeakable. And here is another scope boundary we must keep clean. In this undifferentiated movement, we are not yet talking about particular differences in the world. We are not yet saying, here is time, or here is space, or here is motion. Those are later readouts, omega, kappa, and nu. And they belong to the differentiated movement, where change becomes publicly readable under licensing. Here we are still at the permission layer. Now let me address the most common misunderstanding, because if we don't, it will sneak in later and ruin everything. People hear capacity, and they immediately think they know what it means. They say, oh, you mean potential energy? No. Potential energy is already inside the matured physical language. It assumes measurement. It assumes quantification. It assumes dynamics. It assumes the readouts we have not yet earned. Phi is prior to those assumptions. Phi is what makes potential and actual meaningful categories at all. That is why we cannot let the mind collapse levels here. This is not about a hidden reservoir of fuel. This is about the logical permission for difference, the bare condition for any measurable, shareable structure to exist. Now I want to bring the emotional weight back, because this isn't just sterile logic. This is about what it means for a universe to be able to be understood. And I want you to feel how radical this is. It means the deepest foundation is not what is. The deepest foundation is what could be different. That tiny phrase, could be different, is the seed of every law, every object, every history, every mind. If there were no could be different, then even if you imagine the world full of events, those events could not be separated into facts. They would not be facts. They would be an undivided blur. No truth, no error, no learning, no memory. So when we say phi is the permission, we are saying something brutally practical. Without phi, you cannot even be wrong. And if you cannot be wrong, you cannot be right. You cannot discover. You cannot correct. You cannot build a science. That is why the firewall insists on earning this. Because any later structure, any equation, any model, any claim stands on this permission. Now I want to anchor this in one clean phrase that you will carry. Because part 5 must leave the listener with one sentence that can survive the week. Here it is. Phi is not the difference between things. Phi is what allows things to be different at all. Say to yourself slowly, not the difference, the permission. Not the outcome, the capacity. Now, one more important consequence. If phi is capacity for difference, then you must expect a very specific shape to the next steps of our journey. It means that when the universe begins to become readable as change, what we will see first is not things. We will see readouts. We will see the first public faces of change, the ways difference becomes structured and comparable under licensing. And we already know from the HOLOPHASE stance that those readouts arrive together. Omega, omega. Kappa, kappa. Nu, nu. Temporal, spatial, kinematic. But not as primitive containers, as co-emergent shadows cast by the same differentiating phi. But we are not there yet. We do not rush. Because if you rush, you will smuggle. And smuggling is exactly what episode 13 is designed to prevent. So we end part 5 with a calm closure and a clean handoff. Here is the firewall check, spoken plainly before we move on. The claim: phi is capacity for difference, not difference itself. The prediction: every public knowledge system will reduce to structured distinguishability and license stabilization of outcomes. The falsification: a publicly checkable phenomenon whose complete description requires no distinction anywhere. The scope: the permission layer. Before differentiated readouts and before any claim about space, time, matter, energy, or dynamics as primitives. And the contract remains. If you hear me smuggling space, time, energy, matter, or dynamics as primitives here, treat it as an error. Now breathe. We have done something most people never do. We have separated the power to differ from a particular difference. We have stood in the quiet before the first note. We have sat at the loom before the first knot. We have protected the foundation from confusion. And now we are ready to take the next step, gently. If phi is a permission, how does that permission become public? How does difference become something more than private feeling? How does it become shared, checkable, and stable? That door opens in the next part. For now, hold the listener carry. Phi is not the difference. Phi is the permission that makes difference possible. And let that sentence do what it does. Quietly, deeply. Like a note that has not yet been played, but can be. Salam. Peace be upon you.